1. The military medical facility had been locked down for over 6 hours, and no one inside could explain how things had escalated this far. Because Alpha Kale Draven was not just any soldier, he was a decorated commander, a man known for precision and control. But now he stood at the center of the containment room, breathing unevenly, as if fighting an invisible storm. His uniform torn from earlier treatment procedures, reinforced restraints fastened around his wrists and anchored to a steel frame bolted into the concrete floor. And yet the air itself felt unstable, as if responding to him rather than the other way around. Monitors flickered while technicians spoke in hushed urgency, every reading pushing into territory no one wanted to acknowledge, because what was happening was not just physical trauma, but something deeper tied to his alpha instincts, something medicine alone could not regulate. And so the decision had been made hours earlier after all other attempts failed. The command chain authorized an emergency protocol rarely used to summon his bonded Omega, the one listed in official records as his future partner, because only a compatible Omega pheromone could stabilize this kind of condition. But the person who arrived was not the one the documents named. No one inside the facility knew that, and no one questioned it. Because the young Omega who stepped out of the transport vehicle carried the correct identification, wore the expected uniform, and matched the appearance closely enough that no one looked deeper. His name was Aaron Vale. Though in every official file that mattered, he did not exist. He had lived his life quietly behind someone else's shadow. His twin heiress was the one known to the world, the one celebrated, the one promised to Kale Draven, while Aaron had always been hidden, overlooked, and spoken of only in whispers. But now he stood at the threshold of a sealed containment unit with no explanation and no voice to ask for one. His silence was not just emotional but literal, and yet his eyes revealed everything: confusion, fear, and a quiet resignation that had been shaped by years of being chosen last. A technician gave a brief instruction to follow the light indicators on the floor and remain calm. Though even they did not sound convinced, the heavy door opened with a controlled hiss, and Aaron stepped inside, the sound ceiling shut behind him echoing louder than expected. The room was dim, lit only by overhead panels designed to minimize sensory overload. And for a moment nothing happened. Then the sound came. A sharp metallic strain as tension built against the restraints. Kale lifted his head, the bandage across, his eyes obscuring full vision but not awareness. His breathing shifted immediately, as if detecting something new in the environment, something unfamiliar, and in the next instant he moved. The restraints did not hold him the way they were supposed to. Not fully. The force behind his motion disrupted the balance of the entire system, and within seconds he had crossed the distance between them, his hand reaching forward and closing around Aaron's shoulder firmly enough to stop him in place. The response outside the room was immediate. Alarms triggered and a team prepared to intervene. But before the command could be given, something unexpected happened. Aaron, frozen in place and unable to speak, reacted instinctively, not with movement, but with presence. His pheromones released in a soft, unintentional wave, subtle and almost imperceptible compared to the aggressive surges that had filled the room before. And yet the effect was immediate. Kale's grip did not tighten, it steadied. His posture shifted slightly as if recalibrating. The overwhelming pressure in the room eased just enough for the monitors to reflect a downward trend. Outside the observation glass, the medical staff stared in disbelief. Numbers that had refused to stabilize for hours were now adjusting, slowly but undeniably. One of the doctors leaned closer to the display and spoke in a low, controlled tone, instructing Aaron through the communication system to maintain proximity and not retreat. Aaron did not fully understand the technical language, but he understood the urgency, and so he remained where he was, even as his hands trembled slightly at his sides. Kale's breathing changed again, deeper this time, more controlled, his head tilted as if focusing on something beyond sight. And then without warning he turned toward the far wall where surveillance cameras were mounted. His reaction was precise, almost deliberate, and within seconds the first camera feed went dark, followed by another, and then another, until the observation room was left with nothing but static. A wave of tension swept through the staff. Voices overlapped with uncertainty, debating whether to override the system and re-establish visual contact. But no one acted immediately, because the data they still had showed continued stabilization, and intervening could risk undoing that fragile progress. Inside the room, now free from external observation, The atmosphere shifted again. Kale did not release Eren, but his hold was no longer forceful. Instead, it became something steadier, almost grounding. He guided Eren a few steps closer, closing the remaining distance between them, and then stopped, not in aggression, but in stillness. Eren felt the change before he could process it. The tension that had filled the room earlier had softened, not disappeared, but redirected. Kale's voice when it came was low and rough from disuse, barely above a breath, asking for something simple, not a command but a request, to stay, to not withdraw. Eren nodded, even though Kale could not see it clearly, and allowed his presence to remain open, the subtle release of pheromones continuing in a steady rhythm. And for the first time since the incident began, Kale Draven stood without resistance from his own body. The storm within him quieted not by force, but by something far more unexpected, something no one outside that room had anticipated. And as the alarms in the control center gradually fell silent, replaced by cautious monitoring, a realization settled over the team. The Omega they believed they had called for was not the one standing inside, and yet he was the only one who could reach Kale at all. And whatever had just begun inside that sealed room was no longer part of any standard protocol. It was something else entirely, something that could not be measured or predicted, and from that moment forward, nothing about this situation would follow the rules they thought they understood too. The stabilization did not end when the alarms quieted. It only shifted into something more controlled, more fragile, because every person outside that sealed room understood that what they were witnessing was not a cure, but a temporary balance, one that depended entirely on the Omega inside, the one they believed to be Eris Vale. And from that moment forward, no one attempted to replace him. No one suggested rotating staff or introducing additional support, because every data point confirmed the same truth. Kale Draven's condition responded to one presence and one presence only. And so the orders were updated, access restricted, protocols rewritten in real time to ensure that the Omega remained within immediate reach at all times. And inside the containment room, the shift was just as noticeable. Kale no longer moved with uncontrolled force, his posture steadier, his breathing more even, though not fully normal. Not yet. And Eren, still carrying a name that was not his, remained close, unsure of what would happen if he stepped away, unsure of what was expected beyond simply staying. And yet that alone seemed to be enough, because every time he moved even a few inches farther, Kale's attention followed, subtle but unmistakable, like an instinct recalibrating itself around a fixed point. And when Eren returned closer, the tension eased again, reinforcing something neither of them fully understood, but both were beginning to feel, a connection that had not been planned, not documented, not anticipated. And outside the room, the first doubts began to form, not loud enough to challenge authority, but persistent enough to linger. One of the senior physicians reviewed the compatibility charts again, comparing the recorded data of Eris Vale with the readings they were now seeing, and the discrepancy was not minor. It was significant, far beyond what could be explained by stress or environmental variables. But the records had already been verified, cleared through official channels, and no one was willing to question the documentation provided by a family of that standing, not without direct cause. And so the doubt remained unspoken, filed away as something to revisit later, while attention stayed focused on maintaining Kale's stability, and miles away from the facility, in a residence that operated under far different priorities. The truth was far simpler and far colder. The Omega who had been sent was never meant to be Eris, because Eris had never left that house, seated comfortably in a well-lit room, surrounded by reassurance and careful explanations, told that the situation had become too unstable, too unpredictable, that it would be unsafe for him to go, that alternative arrangements had already been made, and he accepted this without protest, because he had always been protected, always been chosen, and the idea that someone else would take his place was not new to him. It had always been that way, ever since the day he and his twin had been identified as different, despite being born minutes apart, because Eren had never been introduced to the world the same way, never been presented, never been acknowledged beyond what was necessary to maintain appearances. His silence had made it easier, his lack of resistance even more so. And so when the decision was made to send him instead, there was no discussion, no negotiation, just quiet instructions: dress him, prepare him, remind him of the name he would carry, and when questions were asked, if they were asked at all, he would respond the way he always had, with a nod, with a shake of his head, with Nothing that could reveal more than what others chose to see. And that was exactly what had happened. Every checkpoint, every confirmation, every moment where the truth could have surfaced had passed without incident, because no one expected deception from a place that had everything to lose. And now that decision had set something in motion that could not be easily reversed, because inside the containment room, Cale Draven was not responding to a name or a title, he was responding to something far more fundamental, something that could not be replicated or substituted. And as the hours passed, that reality became harder to ignore. Eren remained where he was instructed, close enough that Cale could reach him without effort, far enough that he did not feel trapped. And in that space, something began to settle, not a full recovery, not yet, but a pattern, a rhythm that both of them adjusted to without needing words. And for Eren, the uncertainty remained, because he did not know how long this would last, did not know what would happen when Cale recovered fully, when his sight returned, when the need for stabilization ended, and whether the name he carried would still be accepted, or whether the truth would surface in a way that left him with nothing again. And yet for now, he stayed, because leaving was not an option, and because for the first time in his life, his presence was not being ignored, not being dismissed, but needed, even if only for a moment. And that moment, fragile as it was, held everything in place. While outside, the first official report was filed, confirming that Commander Cale Draven had entered a stable phase under Omega support, listing the name Eris Vale as the contributing factor, and with that single line, the record was sealed, the truth buried beneath it, and the path forward set on a course that no one involved could fully predict, because the Omega they believed they had sent and the Omega Cale Draven had accepted were not the same, and sooner or later, that difference would matter. And inside the quiet of that sealed room, Cale shifted slightly, his hand tightening just enough to stop Eren from stepping back, his voice low and steady in a way it had not been before, as he spoke a simple sentence that carried more weight than anyone outside could hear. Don't go. And though Eren could not answer with words, he did not pull away. By the next operational cycle, the containment wing had been reorganized around a single directive: keep the Omega close, and everything else became secondary. The staff moved with quiet efficiency behind reinforced glass, monitors steady, but watched with the kind of focus that did not relax even when the numbers improved. And inside the room, Cale Draven stood without restraints for the first time since his arrival. Not because the risk was gone, but because the pattern had proven itself reliable. As long as the Omega remained within reach, his condition held, and that Omega, recorded and addressed as Eris Vale, stayed where he had been instructed, a few feet away, still and attentive, his silence continuing to pass as shock, his nods accepted as compliance. And when a technician's voice came through the speaker asking him to step back for a brief assessment, he hesitated for only a moment before following the instruction. One step, then another, the distance widening to just beyond arm's reach, and for a breath nothing changed. The monitors held, the air remained steady, until Cale's posture shifted, subtle but immediate, his shoulders tightening, his breathing losing its rhythm, his head turning sharply toward the empty space where the Omega had been. And before any further command could be given, he moved, crossing the distance in a single controlled step and stopping the Omega with a firm grip at his sleeve, not forceful enough to harm, but absolute in its intent. The readings corrected almost instantly, numbers stabilizing as if the room itself had settled again, and the voice over the speaker paused before continuing in a more cautious tone, instructing the Omega to remain in place, no further distance testing required. And Cale did not release him right away, his hand staying where it was, as if confirming that the position would not change again, his breathing steadying, his stance returning to something closer to controlled awareness. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the quiet room, low but deliberate: stay where I can reach you. The words not raised, not sharp, but final in a way that required no repetition, and the Omega gave a small nod, adjusting his position just enough to remain within that invisible boundary. And from that point on, the room operated differently, movement slowed, interactions minimized, and every adjustment accounted for Cale's response. When a medic attempted to step closer for a routine check, Cale's attention shifted immediately, his posture tightening again, not escalating, but clearly resistant. And before the medic could complete the motion, Cale spoke, without looking away from the Omega: not closer. The instruction simple, controlled, and enough to halt the approach. The medic stepped back without argument, and the room settled again. the pattern reinforcing itself in real time. And through it all, the Omega remained at the center of that pattern, not because he moved or acted, but because he did not, his presence steady, his responses minimal, his pheromones consistent in a way that required no conscious effort. And Kale adjusted to that constancy with increasing precision, his movements no longer reactive but intentional, his attention anchored. And for the first time since the incident began, there was a sense of predictability in how he would respond, not to commands, not to procedures, but to proximity, to presence, to the quiet figure who remained within reach. And as the hours passed, that predictability deepened into something more defined. When the Omega shifted, even slightly, Kale noticed. When he stilled, Kale matched that stillness. And when he stepped closer, Kale's posture eased in response, a pattern forming that no one outside could fully map, but everyone inside could feel. And it was during one of those quieter intervals that Kale moved again, slower this time, deliberate, closing the small gap that still remained until he stood directly in front of the Omega, not imposing, not threatening, simply present, his hand lifting once more, not to stop or restrain but to rest lightly against the fabric of the Omega's sleeve, confirming position without pressure. And he spoke again, his voice lower now, steadier than before. Right here. The words quieter, almost measured against the rhythm of his breathing, and the Omega did not step back, did not hesitate, only inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, and remained. The room holding that stillness without interruption, the staff watching the monitors, the readings stable, the environment controlled. And inside that control, something unspoken continued to take shape, something defined. Not by procedure, but by repetition, by choice made again and again without being named. And as the cycle closed and the lights dimmed slightly to signal the end of the monitoring period, Kale's hand did not move away, his attention did not shift, and the space between them did not change, because by then the rule no longer needed to be spoken. It had already been set. Stay within reach for. The next cycle began with a new routine that no one needed to announce, because it had already settled into place through repetition. Kale Draven no longer required constant verbal instruction, his movements measured, his responses controlled, and the only variable that continued to matter was distance, or more precisely, the absence of it, because as long as the Omega remained within reach, everything held steady. And so the staff adjusted their procedures around that fact, limiting direct interaction, reducing unnecessary motion, and allowing the space between Kale and the Omega to remain uninterrupted. And inside that space, something quieter began to take shape, not sudden, not dramatic, but consistent, the kind of change that could only be noticed over time. Kale no longer needed to reach out every time the Omega shifted, because the Omega had already learned where to stand, how close to remain, how to move without breaking that invisible line. And Kale responded in kind, his presence no longer sharp or reactive, but steady, his attention fixed not on the room, not on the staff, but on the one person who did not leave. And it was during one of these quieter intervals that Kale spoke again, not as a command this time, but as a simple observation. You don't pull away. And the Omega lowered his gaze slightly, a small movement that might have been mistaken for hesitation. But Kale did not interpret it that way, because he had already learned the difference between fear and absence. And this was neither. This was something else, something that remained even when there was no instruction to do so. And for a moment the room held that stillness, the kind that felt deliberate rather than empty, before Kale shifted closer, just enough to reduce the remaining space between them, his voice quieter when he spoke again. Stay. And the Omega nodded, the motion small, automatic, and accepted without question. And from that point forward the word no longer needed to be repeated, because the Omega did not move unless instructed, and even then, only within limits that Kale had already set without saying. And outside the containment wing, a very different conversation unfolded in a quiet, well-appointed room where the atmosphere carried none of the urgency of the facility, only calculation. Eris Vale sat comfortably while a family member reviewed the latest report, the official document confirming that Kale Draven's condition had stabilized under Omega support, his name printed clearly as the contributing factor. And the reaction was not relief, not concern, but satisfaction, because the outcome aligned perfectly with what they had intended. One voice noted that the risk had been higher than expected, another dismissed it, pointing out that the result justified the decision, that the arrangement had protected what mattered while still securing the connection to Kale Draven. And Eris listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, because nothing being said challenged what he had always known, that his position was secure, that his value was recognized, and that whatever had been required to maintain that would be handled without involving him directly. And when the conversation shifted toward future arrangements, toward timing, toward how and when he would be reintroduced, there was no hesitation, only agreement, because to them the situation was already resolved. The temporary measure had worked, the risk had passed, and the path forward remained exactly as planned. And far from that controlled certainty, inside the containment room, the reality continued to evolve in a way none of them accounted for. Because what had begun as a necessity was becoming something else, something neither Kale nor the Omega had been instructed to create, and yet both were moving toward it without resistance. Kale's awareness sharpening in ways that had nothing to do with recovery protocols, his attention narrowing not out of instability, but focus. And the Omega, still silent, still carrying a name that was not his, responding not because he had been told to, but because he chose to remain, and that choice, quiet as it was, began to change the space between them, making it less about control and more about presence, and it showed in the smallest ways, in how Kale adjusted his position without being prompted, in how the Omega shifted to match that adjustment without hesitation, in how neither of them needed instruction to maintain what the staff could only describe as stability. And as the cycle progressed, another change surfaced, subtle but undeniable. Kale no longer reacted when others entered the room as long as they kept their distance. His focus did not break, his posture did not tighten, because his attention did not leave the Omega. And when one of the staff members spoke through the system to confirm that conditions were holding, Kale did not respond, not because he could not hear, but because the question did not matter. The answer was already present in the steady rhythm of his breathing, in the absence of tension, in the fact that he had not once needed to reach out to stop the Omega from moving, because the Omega had not moved at all. And as the lights dimmed slightly to signal the transition into the next monitored period, Kale shifted just enough to close the last fraction of distance between them, his hand resting again against the Omega's sleeve, not to hold, not to restrain, but to confirm. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the strain it once had, only quiet certainty. Stay like this. And the Omega inclined his head once more, remaining exactly where he was, because for the first time, staying was not just an instruction, it was something he understood without needing to be told. 5. The shift did not come with warning this time. It began as a subtle change in the air, something the instruments detected before anyone inside the room fully understood what was happening. Kale Draven's breathing altered first, deeper, sharper, the controlled rhythm that had been maintained for days fracturing into something unstable, and the readings spiked in a pattern that immediately triggered concern outside the glass. Voices overlapping as commands were issued, but inside the room Aaron felt it before he heard anything, the pressure building around Kale not outward, but inward, like something collapsing toward a single point, and instinct told him to step back, to create distance, but he did not move, because he had seen this before, only not like this, not this intense. And then Kale moved, faster than before, not measured, not restrained, his hand catching Aaron's arm and pulling him forward with a force that was not fully controlled, and for a fraction of a second Aaron lost balance, his breath catching as fear surged through him, because this time there was no hesitation in Kale's movement, no pause that suggested awareness, only instinct, raw and overwhelming. And outside the room the response was immediate, multiple voices calling for intervention, security shifting forward, but no one crossed the threshold, because what followed stopped them. Kale's grip tightened, his other hand bracing against Aaron's shoulder, and the pressure spiked again, the kind that had previously led to destruction, to loss of control, and Aaron felt it directly now, not as danger alone, but as something chaotic, something searching without direction. And for the first time he hesitated, his body reacting before his mind could steady it, his hand lifting instinctively as if to push away, but he stopped himself, because somewhere beneath that instability he recognized something else, something familiar, and instead of pulling back, he stayed, even as his breath shook slightly, even as the pressure made it difficult to stand steady, and slowly, carefully, he allowed his presence to expand, not forcefully, not in opposition, but in response, the quiet pheromone he carried rising just enough to meet Kale's, not to suppress, but to align, and the effect was not immediate. Kale did not release him, did not step back. Instead the tension spiked again, sharper this time, his grip tightening just enough that Aaron felt it. A brief moment where control nearly slipped completely, and the room outside reacted, one step away from breaking protocol, but then it shifted. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but enough. Cale's breathing hitched, the sharp edge in it faltering as if something had reached through the chaos and anchored it, and Aaron felt it the moment it happened. The instability no longer expanding, but beginning to settle, uneven, fragile, but real, and he did not stop, even though fear still lingered in the back of his mind. Even though his body had not fully relaxed, he stayed exactly where he was, his presence steady, allowing that alignment to deepen, and slowly, piece by piece, Cale's hold changed, the force in it easing, not completely, but enough that it was no longer overwhelming. And for the first time in that moment, Cale's awareness flickered back, not fully, not clearly, but enough to recognize what he was holding on to, his grip loosening slightly as if correcting himself, and then tightening again, but this time not out of loss of control, but out of something else, something more deliberate. And his voice came low, strained at first, but present. Stay. And it was not a command of dominance, but of necessity, and Aaron did not move, because despite everything, despite the fear that had nearly pushed him away, he understood that leaving now would break whatever fragile hold Cale had regained, and so he stayed, allowing the connection to hold, allowing the pressure to settle further, and outside the room the readings began to change, not returning to baseline immediately, but shifting in a direction that had not been seen before, the spikes smoothing out, the instability narrowing instead of expanding, and the tension among the staff shifted from alarm to something closer to disbelief, because what they were witnessing was not suppression, it was adaptation, and inside the room Cale's breathing steadied further, the sharp edge fading, replaced by something controlled again, though not as detached as before, his hold on Aaron no longer forceful, but firm, grounded, as if confirming that the presence he had nearly overwhelmed was the same one keeping him anchored. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, steadier, "Don't move." And this time Aaron understood, not as instruction, but as trust, and he did not move, not because he was afraid, but because he chose not to. And as the last of the instability faded, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, Cale did not release him, did not create distance. Instead, he drew him slightly closer, not abruptly, not out of impulse, but with control, as if testing the boundary he had nearly crossed. And when nothing broke, when the balance held, something shifted in his expression, not visible to the staff, but clear to Aaron, recognition, not just of what had happened, but of who had allowed it to resolve. And outside the room the tension finally broke, not into relief, but into realization, because this was no longer a matter of containment. This was something else entirely, something they could not replicate, could not replace. And inside that space, the distance between Cale and Aaron no longer felt like something that needed to be managed, but something that had already begun to define itself. 6. By the following cycle, the containment wing no longer operated under uncertainty, but under adaptation. Every procedure recalibrated around a reality no one had planned for, yet no one could deny. Cale Draven was stable, not because the system had improved, not because the suppression field had been perfected, but because the Omega identified as Eris Vale remained within reach. And after the previous incident, no one questioned that condition again. Distance was no longer tested, it was avoided entirely, and the staff, who had once watched the room with rigid detachment, began to shift in quieter ways, their tone less clinical, their attention less guarded, because what they witnessed was no longer just data but pattern, and pattern, when repeated enough times, became belief. Inside the room Cale stood near the center, unrestrained, his posture steady, his awareness sharp, but no longer scattered. And beside him Aaron remained where he always did, within that invisible boundary that had formed between them, not imposed but understood. And when a technician entered the room for a routine scan, keeping the mandated distance, Cale's attention shifted immediately, not in agitation but in focus, his gaze tracking the movement, his posture tightening just enough to signal that the boundary had been noticed, and the technician paused instinctively, unsure whether to proceed, until Cale spoke, his voice calm but firm. "That's far enough." And the room held still, not because the words were loud, but because they carried weight. The technician stepped back without argument, adjusting position to remain outside that unspoken line, and the shift was immediate. Cale's posture eased again, his attention returning to the Omega without hesitation, and outside the observation glass no one commented, but several of them noted the exchange. Not as a disruption, but as confirmation. The pattern had deepened. It was no longer just about stabilization. It was selective, and that selectivity centered entirely on one person, and Aaron, still silent, still carrying a name that was not his, felt that shift more than anyone, because it was directed at him, not as pressure, not as control, but as something quieter, something that did not demand but did not release either. And over time that presence changed the way he moved, the way he stood, the way he responded, no longer only following instruction but anticipating it, adjusting before Cale needed to react. And Cale noticed, not in words but in the absence of correction, his movements becoming smoother, his awareness more focused, as if aligning with something that no longer felt foreign, and the staff noticed it too, though they described it differently. One of the senior physicians remarked quietly that the Omega's pheromone output was not only consistent but adaptive, responding to fluctuations before they fully manifested, smoothing irregularities in ways that did not match any documented pattern. And another observed that Cale's readings stabilized faster when the Omega initiated movement rather than reacting to it, as if the influence was no longer passive but active, and those observations, recorded and reviewed, began to shift the way the staff perceived the Omega, not as a variable in the system, but as a stabilizing force within it. And that shift extended beyond the data, into behavior, into the way they addressed him, the way their voices softened slightly when speaking through the system, the way instructions became requests rather than commands, because respect, once formed, did not need to be declared. It showed itself in small adjustments, and Aaron, who had never been acknowledged in such a way before, responded the only way he knew how, by remaining steady, by continuing to do what he had been doing from the beginning, staying. And it was during one of these quieter intervals that something new surfaced, not dramatic, not obvious, but distinct. Cale shifted position slightly, his hand lifting as it had before to rest against Aaron's sleeve. But this time the contact lingered differently, not checking, not correcting, but grounding, and Aaron felt it, not as pressure but as warmth, as if the space between them had narrowed beyond physical distance. And at the same moment the monitors outside reflected a change, not a spike, not an alarm, but a subtle adjustment in the baseline readings, a level of stability that had not been recorded before. One of the technicians leaned closer, comparing the data to previous cycles, noting the difference in recovery time, the absence of micro-fluctuations that had once persisted even during stable phases, and the physician who had been observing from the start spoke quietly, almost to himself, that this was not just compatibility, it was resonance, a rare alignment that allowed two systems to stabilize each other rather than one compensating for the other. And inside the room that alignment was felt rather than measured, Cale's breathing steady, his posture relaxed in a way that no longer required effort, and Aaron, standing within that space, no longer felt the same hesitation he had carried before, because for the first time his presence was not just necessary, it was accepted, not as a role, not as a replacement, but as something that fit without needing explanation. And that realization, quiet as it was, changed something within him, the way he held himself, the way he remained without questioning whether he should. And Cale responded to that change immediately, not through words but through action, his hand shifting slightly to draw Aaron closer by a small but deliberate amount, not enough to restrain, but enough to define the space between them as his to control. And when he spoke his voice was steady, grounded, carrying no strain. Stay here. And the Omega did not move away, not because he had been told, but because he no longer wanted to. And outside the containment wing, far removed from the quiet shift taking place within it, the family continued their discussions with the same cold certainty as before, reviewing the reports that confirmed Cale's recovery, speaking of timing, of reintroduction, of how Eris would step back into the position that had been preserved for him. And none of them considered the possibility that the space they intended to reclaim was no longer empty, because inside that sealed room something had already taken root, something that no longer belonged to protocol, to records, or to names, but to presence, to choice, and to a connection that had begun to shape itself beyond anyone's control. 7. The shift after the last incident did not fade. It settled, becoming part of the structure of the room rather than a reaction within it. And by the time the next cycle began, the containment wing operated with a quiet certainty that had not existed before. Kale Draven was no longer treated as a variable to be managed, but as a condition to be maintained. And the Omega at his side was no longer viewed as a temporary solution, but as a constant. And inside the room, that change was even more apparent. Kale stood closer now without needing to close the distance each time. His position naturally aligned with Aaron's, as if that proximity had become his default state. And Aaron, who had once measured every step, every movement, no longer hesitated in the same way, his presence steady, his awareness attuned not to the room but to Kale, and the connection between them, once fragile, now held without effort, until it was tested again, not by system failure this time, but by human error. A new staff member rotated into the wing, briefed but inexperienced with the unspoken boundaries that had formed, and during a routine check he stepped closer than permitted, not out of defiance, but misunderstanding, and the reaction was immediate. Kale moved before the instruction could be corrected, his hand catching Aaron's wrist and pulling him a step back, placing him firmly within that invisible boundary that no one else was allowed to cross, his posture shifting, not unstable, but protective in a way that carried unmistakable intent. And when he spoke, his voice was calm but absolute. "Don't touch him." The words cutting through the room without force, yet leaving no space for argument. The staff member froze, stepping back instantly, the room holding still until the boundary was restored, and only then did Kale's posture ease, his hand remaining at Aaron's wrist for a moment longer, before loosening, not releasing completely, but enough to signal that the immediate threat had passed. And outside the observation glass, the reaction was silent but profound. No one questioned the command, no one corrected it, because what they had seen aligned with everything the data had been showing. The Omega was not just a stabilizer, he was central, and any interference with that dynamic carried consequences. And Aaron felt that shift more than anyone, not because of the words, but because of the way Kale had moved, not out of loss of control, but out of intent. And for a brief moment something unfamiliar surfaced within him, not fear, not confusion, but awareness, that the space he occupied was no longer interchangeable. And that awareness changed the way he stood, the way he remained, not retreating even when the room adjusted around them. And Kale responded to that change immediately, his attention sharpening, his hand shifting slightly, as if confirming that Aaron would not be moved again. And the cycle continued, but with a difference. The distance between them shortened further, not forced, but chosen. Kale standing close enough now that the boundary no longer needed to be maintained through movement, only through presence. And as that presence settled, something else began to surface, subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the stability they had already achieved, but different in a way that the instruments began to register, fluctuations that did not originate from Kale, but from Aaron, not spikes, not instability, but controlled variations that seemed to anticipate changes before they occurred, smoothing them out before they could develop into measurable disruptions. And the staff noticed it almost immediately, one technician pausing over the readings, comparing them to previous cycles, noting that the stabilization curve had shifted, becoming more efficient, more immediate, as if the response was no longer reactive but predictive. And the physician who had been observing since the beginning leaned closer, his voice low as he spoke to no one in particular. "He's not just responding, he's regulating." And the realization settled quietly through the observation room, not declared, but understood, because nothing in their records explained this. Nothing in their protocols accounted for an Omega whose influence adapted before the system itself could react. And inside the room that change was felt rather than measured, Aaron's presence steady, his awareness sharper, not consciously, not intentionally, but in a way that allowed him to adjust without thinking, his breathing aligning with Kale's before irregularities formed, his position shifting by fractions that prevented tension from building, and Kale responded to it instinctively, his posture remaining stable without needing correction, his attention fixed entirely on the one person who now shaped the environment around him. And when he moved, it was no longer to stop Aaron from leaving, but to bring him closer, his hand lifting again, this time resting more firmly at Aaron's wrist before guiding him a half-step nearer, not restraining, not forcing, but defining that closeness as something deliberate, something chosen. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the strain from before, only certainty. "Stay here." The words quiet but grounded, and Aaron did not hesitate, did not question, remaining where he was, because by now that position was no longer assigned, it was understood. And outside the containment wing, The family continued their preparations with the same calculated confidence, reviewing timelines, discussing when Eris would be brought in, how the transition would be handled, assuming that the space within that room remained unchanged, waiting to be reclaimed, unaware that inside, that space had already been filled, not by name, not by record, but by presence, by choice, and by something that had begun to grow beyond either of them, something that did not yet have a name, but had already started to shape everything around it. 8. By the next cycle, the containment room no longer felt like a controlled environment, but a space that responded to its occupants, the air settling into a steady rhythm that did not rely entirely on the suppression field, because something within it had begun to regulate itself. And at the center of that shift stood Kael Draven and the Omega known to everyone else as Eris Vale, though by now the name mattered less than the presence. Kael did not move far from him anymore, not because he needed to, but because he chose not to. His position always aligned within a distance that required no correction, and Eren, who had once measured every step with caution, now remained without hesitation, his awareness attuned to Kael in ways that had become instinctive, subtle adjustments in posture, breathing, and proximity that prevented tension from forming before it could surface, and the staff observed it all with increasing attention, not because they expected instability, but because what they were witnessing no longer fit within any known framework. The stabilization curves had changed, smoother, faster, almost anticipatory, as if the Omega was not reacting to Kael's condition, but shaping it before it could shift. And during a scheduled monitoring interval, the physician in charge initiated a controlled stimulus test, not enough to destabilize, but enough to measure response thresholds. And inside the room, the change was immediate, a slight increase in environmental pressure, a calibrated disturbance designed to provoke a minor fluctuation. And Kael reacted, not with loss of control, but with heightened awareness, his posture tightening, his breathing shifting just enough to signal strain. And before the readings could climb further, Eren moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but precisely, closing the minimal distance that still existed between them, his presence aligning with Kael's in a way that felt deliberate, and the effect was immediate. The fluctuation halted. Before it could develop, the readings stabilizing faster than the system predicted, and outside the room the technician monitoring the data leaned forward, comparing the real-time output to projected models, his voice breaking the silence. That response time is ahead of the system, and another replied quietly, almost disbelieving. It's like he knew before it happened, and the physician did not answer, because the explanation forming in his mind did not belong in a report, and inside the room Kael's attention had already shifted entirely to Eren, not to the stimulus, not to the environment, but to the one presence that had just anchored everything again, his hand lifting, not abruptly, but with clear intent, resting at Eren's arm before sliding slightly higher, closer than before, his grip not tight but certain, as if confirming that the distance between them would not change, and Eren felt it, not as restraint but as definition, the space narrowing until there was no uncertainty left, and for a moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but because the closeness had crossed into something new, something that was no longer purely functional. And that hesitation did not go unnoticed. Kael's gaze fixed on him, his awareness sharp, his voice low when he spoke. Stay. And this time the word carried something different, not instruction, not necessity, but something that held weight beyond either, and Eren did not step back, did not create distance, because even in that moment he understood that leaving was no longer part of the equation, and the air around them shifted again, not from the system, not from the stimulus, but from something that originated between them, a subtle pressure that the instruments struggled to define, the readings adjusting in ways that did not match previous patterns, smoothing, stabilizing, amplifying, and outside the observation glass the staff fell silent, watching as the baseline itself shifted, not temporarily but consistently. One of the technicians, whispering under his breath, "This shouldn't be possible," and no one corrected him, because none of them had an explanation that fit, and inside the room Kael moved closer still, the remaining distance closing completely as his hand shifted again, no longer at Eren's arm but near his shoulder, not pulling, not forcing, but holding him within that space with quiet certainty, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed yet unmistakably anchored to that position. And when he spoke his voice was lower, steadier, carrying an intent that had fully replaced instinct. Right here. And Eren remained, not because he had been told, not because he had to, but because he chose to, even as the closeness pressed against something deeper within him, something that had begun to awaken without being named. And outside the containment wing, far removed from the shift taking place within, the family finalized their plans, their voices calm, their decisions precise, discussing the timing of Eris's return, confident that the space within that room remained unchanged, waiting to be reclaimed, unaware that inside, that space no longer belonged to any name they recognized, but to something that had already formed, something that was no longer temporary, and no longer willing to be replaced. 9. The shift did not begin gently this time. It came like a breaking point that had been building beneath the surface for far too long. The containment room holding a tension that no system had triggered, no external stimulus had caused, and yet every sensor reacted as if something irreversible had begun. Kale Draven's breathing changed first, deeper, sharper, no longer controlled in the quiet way it had been for cycles, but pulled by something stronger, something that no longer responded to restraint. And Aaron felt it instantly, not as danger, not as instability, but as a surge that pressed inward instead of outward, as if everything around them was being drawn into a single point. And before any command could be issued, before the staff could interpret what the readings were showing, Kale moved, not fast, not uncontrolled, but with absolute certainty, his hand closing around Aaron's arm, then pulling him closer in one decisive motion until there was no space left between them. And this time Aaron reacted, not stepping back, but freezing for a fraction of a second, his breath catching, his body registering the shift in a way it had not before, because this was different. This was no longer about stabilization, no longer about control, and that realization hit him all at once, a sharp awareness that something had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and outside the glass the monitors surged, not into alarm, but into something more profound, the readings aligning rapidly, flattening into a pattern so stable it bordered on impossible. One of the technicians speaking without meaning to, his voice tight with disbelief. That's not suppression, that's... But he did not finish, because there was no term in their system for what they were seeing, and inside the room Kale did not release him, did not create distance, his hold shifting from firm to steady, controlled but unyielding, as if anchoring something in place that he refused to let go, his voice low when he spoke, but carrying a weight that filled the entire space. Stay with me. And this time it was not a request, not a command, but a claim, clear and final, and Aaron felt it, not just in the words, but in the way his body responded, in the way the connection between them surged and then settled into something deeper, something that did not fluctuate, did not waver, as if a new baseline had been set within him, and for a brief moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but because the intensity of that shift overwhelmed everything else, his instinct pulling him back for half a step that he did not complete, because Kale's grip tightened just enough to stop that movement, not forceful, but absolute. And in that moment Aaron made a choice, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but out of something that had begun to take root within him long before this point. He did not pull away, did not resist. Instead he leaned into that closeness, allowing the space between them to disappear completely, and the effect was immediate. The surge collapsed into stillness, the monitors outside stabilizing, in a way that none of the staff had ever recorded, one of them whispering, barely audible, "It's permanent." And no one argued, because the data confirmed it. Whatever had been incomplete before had now locked into place. And inside the room Kale's breathing steadied completely, no strain, no fluctuation, his control absolute in a way it had never been, not because it was imposed, but because it no longer needed to be, and his hold on Aaron shifted again, no longer anchoring, but keeping his presence close, unwavering, his voice quieter now, but no less certain, right here. And Aaron remained, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time, he felt it clearly, that he belonged, exactly where he was. And as that realization settled within him, something else changed, subtle but undeniable, a warmth spreading through his awareness, a quiet certainty replacing the uncertainty he had carried since the beginning. And outside the room the staff stood in silence, no longer attempting to explain, no longer reaching for protocol, because what they had just witnessed did not belong to anything they could control. It belonged entirely to the two people inside that space, and far away, in a room filled with calm voices and calculated plans. The family finalized the timing of Eris's return, speaking with confidence about reclaiming what they believed was still waiting for them. unaware that in that exact moment, the space they intended to take back had already been sealed, not by contract, not by decision, but by something far more absolute, something that would not allow itself to be replaced. 10. The shift that followed did not fade with the end of the cycle. It settled into something absolute, something that no longer required monitoring to prove its stability, because by the time the next day began, Kale Draven no longer showed any sign of imbalance. His breathing even, his posture relaxed in a way that carried no tension, no suppression, and no trace of the volatility that had once defined every moment of his presence in that room. The staff confirmed it through every metric. Available, repeated scans, environmental tests, controlled stimuli, all returning the same result. There was nothing left to correct, nothing left to stabilize, and the physician who had overseen the entire process spoke the conclusion quietly, but with certainty: he's fully recovered. And the statement carried weight not because it was unexpected, but because of how it had been achieved. And inside the room, Kale did not react to the declaration, not because he did not hear it, but because it did not change anything that mattered to him. His attention remained where it had been since the moment everything shifted, anchored to Eren, and when the staff began to discuss transition protocols, release procedures, and reintegration timelines. Kale spoke before any of it could be finalized, his voice calm, steady, leaving no room for negotiation. He comes with me. The room fell silent, not because the request was unreasonable, but because it was definitive, and no one inside that facility had the authority to challenge it. The physician hesitated only briefly before nodding, because the data supported what Kale had already decided. Separation was no longer an option, and Eren, standing beside him, felt the weight of that moment settle in a way he could not fully name. Because for the first time the future extended beyond the boundaries of that room, and it included him, not as a placeholder, not as a substitute, but as something chosen, and for a brief stretch of time, that future held the days that followed, quiet, structured, no longer defined by survival, but by adjustment. Kale moving through the world outside containment with the same steady control he had gained within it, and Eren beside him, learning a life that did not require constant caution, the distance between them never widening, not because it needed to be enforced, but because neither of them allowed it to change, until the order came, sudden, unavoidable, a deployment that could not be delayed, a conflict escalating beyond containment, requiring Kale's immediate presence. And for the first time since his recovery, separation became necessary, the decision made quickly, without hesitation, because it was not optional. And when Kale turned to Eren before leaving, his voice was lower, but no less certain. "Wait for me." And Eren nodded, the motion small, but carrying more weight than words, because there was no part of him that questioned that instruction. And then Kale was gone, the departure swift, leaving behind a silence that felt unfamiliar after everything they had built. And it was within that silence that the family moved, their plans already prepared, their timing precise, because they had been waiting for exactly this moment, when Kale would be absent, when the space he had claimed would be left unguarded, and they arrived not with force, but with certainty, their presence controlled, their voices calm as they informed Eren that his role was complete, that he had served his purpose, that everything would now return to its proper place. And for the first time since he had entered that room, Eren was not silent because he chose to be, but because there was nothing he could say that would change what had already been decided. Eris returned in his place, stepping into the role that had always been intended for him, his appearance identical enough, his pheromones carefully managed to match what had been recorded, and to the outside world the transition appeared seamless, the records updated, the identity restored, and Eren was removed just as quietly as he had been placed, sent away to another city, provided with enough to live, enough to remain out of sight, but not enough to return, and the time between departure and return passed quickly, the conflict resolved. Kale completing what had been required of him with the same precision he brought to everything else, and when he returned, it was with the certainty of someone who had left something behind that mattered. And the moment he stepped back into that familiar space, something felt wrong, not visibly, not immediately, but unmistakably. The Omega who stood before him carried the same face, the same scent, the same identity, but the space between them did not align. The distance fell off, the presence unfamiliar in a way that could not be explained, and Kale did not react at first. His expression unchanged, his posture steady, because the difference was subtle, almost imperceptible, and yet it remained, persistent, and when the Omega stepped closer, attempting to close the distance that had once defined everything, Kale's response was immediate, not outwardly aggressive, but clearly resistant, his body shifting just enough to avoid that closeness, his awareness rejecting something that should have felt natural, and the room held that moment in quiet tension, because no one could explain why the pattern had broken, only that it had, and Kale, standing there, did not speak, did not question, but for the first time since his return, his certainty faltered, not in control, not in strength, but in recognition, because the person in front of him matched every expectation, and yet none of them felt right. 11. The days following Kale Draven's return did not unfold as expected, not for him, not for the staff, and certainly not for the Omega who now stood at his side, because although everything appeared correct on the surface, every detail aligned with the records, the face, the scent, the identity, something within the space between them refused to settle, and Kale felt it immediately, not as a clear thought, not as suspicion, but as resistance, subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from fatigue after deployment, but persistent enough that it did not fade, and each time the Omega stepped closer, attempting to reclaim the proximity that had once been natural, Kale's body responded before his mind could interpret it, a slight shift, a fraction of distance created without conscious intent, his posture tightening just enough to disrupt what should have been effortless, and the first time it happened, he dismissed it, attributing the reaction to adjustment, to time, to the fact that recovery had changed him, but the second time, and the third, the pattern held, and patterns, once repeated, could not be ignored, and the staff noticed it too, though none of them spoke of it directly, because the discrepancy was subtle, difficult to define. The Omega's presence met every measurable expectation. His pheromones matched recorded baselines, his behavior aligned with prior observations, and yet Kale's response did not, and that divergence created a quiet tension that no one could resolve, and inside that tension Kale's awareness sharpened, not outwardly, not through confrontation, but through observation, small details that did not fit, movements that lacked the instinctive precision he had grown used to, a fraction of delay where there had once been immediate alignment, a hesitation where there should have been none, and none of it was enough to form a conclusion, but all of it accumulated, building into something that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. And the moment that defined it came without warning, when the Omega reached out, attempting to close the space between them in the same way he had done countless times before, his hand brushing against Kale's arm, and the reaction was immediate, not violent, not aggressive, but unmistakable. Kale stepped back, not deliberately, but reflexively, the movement sharp enough to break the moment entirely, his expression tightening as if rejecting something his body refused to accept, and the room fell silent, the Omega freezing in place, uncertainty flickering across his features before he masked it, and Kale, standing there, did not speak, because there was nothing he could say that would explain what had just happened, only that it should not have, and from that point forward the distance remained, no longer subtle, no longer unintentional, but present, and the more it persisted, the clearer it became. This was not adjustment. This was rejection, not of the person, but of the connection that should have existed, and Kale could no longer ignore it, his thoughts returning, unbidden, to the memory of what that connection had felt like, not in detail, not in image, but in certainty, in the absence of resistance, in the way proximity had once been effortless, inevitable, and that contrast sharpened everything, turning uncertainty into awareness, and awareness into doubt, and doubt, once formed, demanded resolution, and so Kale began to act, not openly, not with confrontation, but with intent, his attention shifting from presence to absence, from what was there to what was missing, reviewing records, observing patterns, testing reactions in ways that did not reveal themselves as tests, creating small variations in distance, in timing, in interaction, and watching, always watching, for the response that would confirm what he had begun to suspect. And each time the result was the same, controlled, correct, but not right, and outside the immediate space. The staff felt the shift as well, the stability that had once defined the environment no longer absolute, not unstable, but incomplete, as if something essential had been removed, leaving behind a structure that functioned but did not hold, and none of them could explain it, only that the difference existed. And far from that controlled tension, in a quieter city where no one watched Aaron move through a life that no longer resembled the one he had left, the days simple, structured, provided for, but empty of the presence that had once defined every moment. And within that absence something else began to surface, subtle at first, a shift in awareness, a faint change in his body that he could not yet name, only feel as a quiet difference that did not belong to the life he was now living. And he did not question it, because there was no one to ask, no one to answer. Only the silence that followed him wherever he went. And back within the containment facility, Cale stood once more at the center of a space that had once felt complete, now holding only an approximation of what had been. And for the first time since his return, he allowed the thought to fully form, not as doubt, but as certainty, that the Omega in front of him, despite matching every expectation, was not the one who had stood with him when everything had changed, and that realization, once accepted, left only one direction to move, not forward, not with what had been given to him, but back, toward the truth that had been taken away. 12. The certainty did not arrive all at once. It formed slowly, piece by piece, until there was no space left for doubt, and by the time Cale Draven moved, it was no longer to question but to confirm. The distance between him and the Omega who stood before him no longer subtle, no longer something he concealed, but deliberate, maintained with quiet precision, and the room had begun to reflect it, the staff adjusting without being told, keeping their interactions brief, their movements careful, because the shift in Cale's behavior had become impossible to ignore, and it was during one of these controlled intervals that Cale acted, not with force, not with raised voice, but with clarity. Come closer. The instruction simple, measured, and the Omega obeyed immediately, stepping forward to close the space. And for a moment everything appeared correct, the distance reduced, the position aligned, and then Cale reached out, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with intent, his hand settling briefly against the Omega's arm, and the reaction was immediate, not from the Omega, but from Cale himself, a subtle tightening, a fraction of withdrawal that he did not conceal this time. His expression unchanged, but his posture unmistakably rejecting what should have felt natural, and the silence that followed was heavier than any confrontation, because the answer had already been given, and Cale did not release the moment, did not step back into uncertainty. Instead, he spoke again, his voice lower, steadier, leaving no room for interpretation. Again, and the Omega hesitated, just briefly, before complying once more, stepping closer, reaching out in the same controlled manner. And once again the result held, correct in appearance, wrong in reality. And this time Cale did not withdraw immediately. He held the contact for a fraction longer, long enough to confirm what he already knew, long enough for the rejection to settle into certainty. And then he stepped back, not abruptly, but with finality, the distance re-established, and when he spoke again, his voice carried no anger, no raised tone, only something far more decisive. Who are you? The question quiet, but absolute, and for the first time since his return, the Omega faltered, not in posture, not in appearance, but in timing, a delay that did not belong to the person Cale remembered, and the room held its breath, the staff outside frozen in place. Because the question had broken the illusion in a way that could not be repaired, and the Omega answered, his voice controlled, his expression steady, repeating the name that had been assigned to him. But the response did not matter, because Cale had already moved past the need for confirmation, his attention shifting, not to the person in front of him, but to everything that had allowed this to happen, the records, the transitions, the silence that had followed his departure. And when he turned, it was not toward the Omega, but toward the observation glass, his voice carrying across the system without needing to be raised. Bring me every record from the day I left. And the command left no room for delay, the staff moving immediately, not because they had been instructed, but because they understood that whatever had just been uncovered would not stop here. And inside the room Cale did not look back, did not re-engage with the person who had been placed before him, because that question had already been answered, not by words, but by absence, and outside the controlled environment, far removed from the tension building within it. The family's certainty began to fracture, reports reaching them not through official channels, but through subtle shifts, requests for records, irregular inquiries, the kind of movement that signaled something had gone wrong. And for the first time their confidence wavered, not openly, not yet, but enough to accelerate their plans, to tighten control, to prepare for the possibility that what had been hidden might not remain so. and far away. In a quieter part of the city where no one paid attention, Aaron moved through a life that had been reduced to routine, the days passing without change, without voice, without presence, until the night that routine broke, not with warning, but with intrusion, a group of alphas stepping into his path with the kind of careless dominance that did not expect resistance. Their voices low, their movements closing in, testing boundaries they assumed did not exist, and Aaron froze for a brief moment, the old instinct surfacing first, the urge to retreat, to avoid, to disappear, but there was nowhere to go, and as the distance closed, something shifted, not outside, but within him, a pressure building where there had once been. Only quiet, unfamiliar but undeniable, and when one of them reached forward, the moment broke, not with violence, but with something far more absolute. The air itself seemed to tighten, a silent force pressing outward from Aaron in a wave that no one could see but all of them felt, their steps faltering, their expressions changing from confidence to confusion, then to something closer to unease, because what stood in front of them was no longer what they had expected, and Aaron did not move, did not raise a hand, but the space around him shifted, heavy, controlled, impossible to ignore, and beneath it, something else pulsed, steady, alive, amplifying that presence in a way that made it impossible to approach, the alphas stepping back without realizing it, their instincts reacting before their minds could understand why. The dominance they carried turning unstable under a pressure that did not yield, and for the first time they hesitated, then withdrew, not defeated, but unwilling to cross something they could not explain, and when they were gone, the pressure faded just as quickly, leaving only silence behind, and Aaron stood there, his breath uneven, his body still adjusting to something he did not yet fully understand, but deep within him, that presence remained, steady, real, no longer faint but unmistakable, and far away, Kale Draven stood at the center of a truth that could no longer be ignored, his path forward no longer uncertain, no longer divided, but clear, because whatever had been taken from him, whatever had been replaced, would not remain that way, not now, not after he had seen through it, and when he moved, it was not with hesitation, but with purpose, because this time he was not searching for answers. He was going to take them back. 13. Kale Draven did not slow when the address was given, because by then the path ahead was no longer uncertain, but fixed with absolute clarity, and every second he had lost was something he intended to take back. The journey passing in a blur that did not matter, because the only thing that did was the pull that had never left him, the connection guiding him without effort to the one person who had been taken from him. And when he arrived, the city around him faded into nothing, because Aaron felt at first, the shift that had once been faint now unmistakable, a steady pull deep within him responding before his mind could understand. And when he turned, Kale was already there, close enough that distance no longer felt real, and for a moment neither of them moved, because everything that had been broken stood between them, and Aaron's first instinct was to step back, the memory of being replaced, discarded, still lingering too close beneath the surface, but Kale moved before that distance could form, closing it in a single decisive step, his hand catching Aaron's wrist, firm but controlled, stopping him, without force, and Aaron resisted only briefly, the hesitation still there but already weakening, and Kale did not release him, his grip steady, grounding, his voice low when he spoke, carrying something that did not allow doubt. "I came back for you." And the words landed differently this time, cutting through the fear that had kept Aaron at a distance, because it was not accusation, not anger, but certainty, and Kale stepped closer, not allowing space to return, his presence unwavering. "You're coming with me." And this time Aaron did not pull away again, because the connection he had felt even in separation now aligned completely, and Kale drew him in, his hold careful but absolute, as if confirming that what had been taken once would never be lost again. And as Aaron steadied against him, the presence within him surged again, no longer subtle, no longer something he could ignore, his breath catching as the realization rose with undeniable clarity, and Kale felt it at the same moment, the resonance between them shifting, deepening into something new, something alive, and his expression changed, not into surprise, but into recognition, his hand moving instinctively, not forceful but protective, settling gently against Aaron's lower abdomen as his voice lowered further, steady and certain. "You're carrying my child." And the words did not come as a question, but as truth, and Aaron stilled completely, his fingers tightening slightly against Cale's sleeve, his breath unsteady for the first time, not from fear but from the weight of what he now understood. And Cale did not move away, his presence anchoring him as he continued, his voice quieter, but edged with something colder. Now, something that carried beyond just the two of them. It protected you before I could. And the memory aligned instantly. The moment Aaron had stood alone, the pressure that had forced others back without a single strike. And Cale's gaze hardened, not toward Aaron, but toward everything that had allowed that to happen. And he did not stay, because there was one thing left unfinished. And this time Aaron did not resist when Cale led him away, his steps steady despite the tremor that still lingered in his chest, because he no longer walked alone. And when they returned, it was not to reclaim a place, but to end what had been left behind. The family stood waiting, their composure no longer as intact as before, the weight of the truth already pressing against them. And Cale did not slow, did not acknowledge their presence with courtesy or restraint. He stopped only when Aaron was beside him, close enough that there was no question who stood where, and his voice when he spoke was calm, controlled, but stripped of anything that resembled tolerance. You replaced the one person who kept me alive. The words landed without force, but with absolute precision, and no one interrupted, because there was nothing to deny, and Cale did not give them the space to respond, his gaze shifting slightly, dismissing them not with anger, but with something far more final. You don't get him back. And the silence that followed was heavier than any punishment, because it was not temporary. It was absolute. And then his attention moved, not to the family, but to Eris, who stood rigid, his composure cracking under the weight of everything he now understood. And Cale's voice did not rise, but it cut deeper because of it. You were never chosen. And that single sentence shattered what remained, because it was not insult, it was truth, and there was nothing Eris could say against it, nothing he could take back. And Cale did not look at him again, because he did not need to. The outcome already decided, the distance already permanent, and behind them the truth had already surfaced, the dormant gene they had ignored, the rare Omega they had discarded, the only one who had ever been able to stand beside him, and now completely beyond their reach. And Cale turned away without hesitation, without a second glance, because there was nothing left behind that held any value. And this time no one stopped him, no one spoke, because they understood what had been lost, not just a person, but something they would never recover. And Aaron walked beside him, no longer uncertain, no longer retreating, his hand tightening slightly in Cale's hold as the presence within him remained steady, alive, no longer hidden. And as they left, the space behind them remained silent, heavy with the weight of choices that could not be undone, while ahead of them, there was nothing left to take, nothing left to replace, only something that had already proven it would endure, this time without question and without end.